Authentic is sponsored in whole by Voice of Prophecy.
People have long dreamed of building the perfect place to live, paradise, a Garden of Eden. And it's understandable that we want to do that because real life is pretty hard. But there's a serious flaw with utopian thinking, a flaw that shows up every single time we try.
Welcome to Authentic. Shawn Boonstra explores real existential questions about the meaning of your life and how you can live a genuine human existence. Listen every week right here on this station or on your favorite podcatcher. Here's Shawn with this week's episode of Authentic.
Back in my college days, and really back in my pre-Christian days, I was forced to read this book, Plato's Republic. Now, that's not so unusual because this is fairly standard reading for first-year college students, and at the age of, 17 or 18, this was really the first complete work written by a Greek philosopher that I ever read cover to cover. I mean, I've been dabbling in philosophy, but nothing quite like this. And if I'm honest about it, I really hated this book. The professor who assigned this thought it presented a reasonable template for building a better, more just society, and he suggested that we would all do very well to pay attention to what Plato was proposing. So, of course, I read it, mostly because I had to, and this is actually the very copy I bought from the bookstore in the fall of 1987. Now, personally, I'm not convinced that Plato meant this as a blueprint for building a utopia, and I honestly think it was more of a thought experiment designed to help his audience explore the meaning of one important concept, and that concept is justice. What does justice look like? How can everybody get a fair shake? And Plato makes his case by using the metaphor of a well-ordered city. That city, I believe, stood for the individual. Kind of the way John Bunyan used a city to represent a single individual in his brilliant book, The Holy War. So, this is what I wrote in my term paper. This is a metaphor. And the professor, of course, was underwhelmed by my teenaged attempt to undermine one of his favorite books. And he remained absolutely convinced that there was something to Plato's work that everybody should pay attention to. He said this is the blueprint for a better government. And of course, that position left me very unhappy, because if you take this book to be some kind of political manual, and honestly some people do, you're going to run into some really serious ethical issues. For starters, let's think about the people Plato apparently thinks are inferior to him. As far as the ancient Greeks were concerned, the philosopher was the highest station in life. Good philosophers were enlightened, elite human beings who lived well above the rest of us up in the moral stratosphere. Plato thought he was the smartest man in the room, the one who was able to tap into the wisdom of the universe. And so, of course, when he was designing his ideal society, he put the philosopher-king at the very top of the power pyramid, because he was obviously suited to rule all the rest of us, and the rest of us should be happy about it. Of course, 2,600 years later, after some of these ancient eggheads actually applied their knowledge to running a society, we can definitively say that they did not solve our worst problems. They proved to be no better than the warrior kings, and sometimes they were actually worse. That's because running something like a civilization has far too many variables for anybody to ever make a perfectly informed decision. Of course, that didn't stop these people from trying, and somewhere along the way, a lot of these so-called sophisticated rulers, intellectuals, started to lose their grip on the value of individual people. Their intellectual and ideological goals became more important than the value of a single human life. And so eventually, the people they governed became expendable. They started to make decisions that completely ignored individual rights. Now, obviously, you and I prize individualism a lot more than some of our ancestors did. And the American Revolution is really the product of hundreds of years of careful thinking. And we sometimes forget just how difficult it was to codify the natural rights that you and I now enjoy. But let's get back to the ancients, who probably prized a hierarchy more than most of us do. One of the problems that emerges when you have a handful of power brokers sitting at the top is censorship. This one might sound familiar given the current political climate here in the West, where some people really don't think that their ideological opponent should be allowed to say anything. According to Plato, only the philosopher-kings could possibly be smart enough to know which ideas should be allowed and which ones shouldn't. The ruling class would have to take charge of what children were allowed to learn, so that nobody would develop a new philosophy that undermined the ruler's power. Now, the lead character in Plato's Republic is Socrates, the great philosopher who didn't apparently write a book of his own. The primary way we know about what Socrates believed is through the writings of Plato, who uses his character to guide philosophical discussions. And here's what Plato had Socrates say about censorship. And I quote, "First, as it seems, we must supervise the makers of tales. And if they make a fine tale, it must be approved, but if it's not, it must be rejected. We'll persuade nurses and mothers to tell the approved tales to their children and to shape their souls with tales more than their bodies with hands. Many of those they now tell must be thrown out." So let's think about what this is saying. He's saying mothers aren't smart enough to know what's good for their children, so the state should regulate what they're allowed to say. Every child must only learn the stories that help them appreciate the state and nothing else. So in other words, the state owns your children. And if that concept actually appeals to you, you might want to spend a little more time thinking it through. I mean, when in the history of humanity has the state ever proven to have your very best interests at heart? When? Ever? This idea that the state owns you is a key feature of just about any totalitarian regime. The state, they say, is not your servant, and it's not there to serve your needs or protect your ability to live. Instead, it's the other way around. The state considers you to be an asset, a tool for maintaining its own well-being. I mean, you'll notice a guy like Hitler immediately went after the kids because he believed that if he could change the way the children think, he'd have their loyalty for life. And the same thing happened in the former Soviet Union. They went after the kids as a way to eliminate resistance in the future. And now, tragically, we're starting to hear this same kind of thinking right here in the West. This idea that the state has primary ownership, primary responsibility for your children. And because of that, they're going to determine what you're allowed to read or say and what you're not allowed to read or say. Now, here in the United States, and for that matter, most of the Western nations, the idea of a book ban probably isn't going to fly, at least not yet. But when it comes to online content, pay attention to what's going on. We now have no shortage of people suggesting that what we see on social media should be heavily regulated by government. And they're not talking about things like graphic violence or pornography, where you could make a case that maybe these kinds of things shouldn't be out in the open in an environment that clearly involves young people. I'm really talking about having the wrong political opinion. And right now, it doesn't seem to matter which side of the ideological fence you sit on, you will find plenty of people who would be very happy to legally shut down your ability to express yourself. And of course, in recent history, we've seen lots of opposition to the social media platform TikTok because people now fear that the Chinese government is using it to harvest data. Now, for that reason, personally, I wouldn't put TikTok on my phone. But now we have governments proposing that we simply ban the whole platform altogether nationwide. And honestly, I understand why they're thinking that. I understand why the government doesn't want its employees to use this platform. But are you really sure you want to give a government even greater ability to control the information you consume? Now, censorship was just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to objectionable ideas in the writings of Plato. But right now, the clock on the wall wishes to censor me, so I have to take a break. Hey, Shawn Boonstra here. Did you know you can watch Authentic every week? Yep. Just search for Authentic with Shawn Boonstra on YouTube. It's that easy. Catch new episodes every week during our regular seasons and watch for free. And while you're at it, would you tell one or two people about the show? Thanks for your support.
This is Authentic with Shawn Boonstra and the Voice of Prophecy.
The next horrible idea I found in Plato's Republic suggests that because people are essentially competitive by nature, we should eliminate the concept of private property. Here's what it says. And what about this? Won't lawsuits and complaints against one another, in a word, vanish from among them thanks to their possessing nothing private but the body, while the rest is in common? On this basis, they will then be free from faction, to the extent, at any rate, that human beings divide into factions over the possession of money, children, and relatives. Now you tell me, does it sound familiar? You will own nothing and you will be happy. It's another concept you'll find emerging in almost every utopian experiment, this idea that the state should own everything, because again, obviously, the state knows better than you. And so we get despots, people who are absolutely convinced that they are the smartest people in the room and they can do whatever they want, quote, for the good of everybody. So they start to confiscate stuff and funnel it all to the top. And if you try to protest, you'll be decried as selfish because apparently you're not interested in the welfare of others, which is just not true. And then Plato comes to what is probably his most horrific concept, this idea that a philosopher-king might be smart enough to actually sculpt the human race, breeding us like farm animals to eliminate our very worst traits. And you might think that could never happen. But how do you explain the race experiments of the Third Reich, or the eugenics craze that existed right here in the U.S. back in the 1920s? Why is it that utopians almost always land on the idea that some people are undesirable? They're standing in the way of progress. In Plato's Republic, Socrates asks a guy about his farm animals, and he asks if a responsible farmer would fail to breed the animals wisely. Here's what he says. "My dear comrade," I said, "how very much we need eminent rulers after all, if it is also the same with the human species. Because it will be a necessity for them to use many drugs," I said. Presumably, we believe that for bodies not needing drugs, but willing to respond to the prescribed course of life, even a common doctor will do. But of course, when there is also a need to use drugs, we know there is a need of the most courageous doctor. That's pretty horrible thinking. He's suggesting that ordinary problems can be solved by ordinary people, but when it comes to the big stuff, the big problems, you're going to need the doctors. In other words, the philosopher-kings to help you solve your problems. And they're probably going to have to administer some really bitter medicine to keep the people in line. The drugs are just a metaphor for the difficult ideas that average people are going to hate when the government implements them. It continues. To this I said, "It's likely that our rulers will have to use a throng of lies and deceptions for the benefit of the ruled. And of course we said that everything of this sort is useful as a form of remedy." In this way of thinking, the ends always justify the means. If you have to lie to the people to get what you want, so be it. After all, it's for their own good. And you are, after all, the benevolent ruler, and you're the one who knows what's best for all. Now, does any of this sound remotely familiar? You know, it actually gets worse. Plato then suggests that the ruling class should be able to choose who gets to have kids. You can't just allow ordinary people to go out and reproduce. That privilege should be reserved for the brightest and the best. Look, what this all boils down to is a very low view of humanity. People are expendable if you think you are charting a course toward a better society. Joseph Stalin is rumored to have said, look, if you're going to have to make an omelet, you're going to have to break a few eggs. And with that, he put millions of his own people to death. He banished their ideas and then eventually banished their persons. He starved millions in Ukraine and sent millions more to die in the gulags because, well, in his empire, life was cheap. And you can't let people stand in the way of building paradise. And that's where building utopia faces its very biggest challenge. It comes from this idea that you and I are capable of actually restoring paradise. We all seem to have this collective memory that somehow, some way, this world used to be a much better place. We understand that the world hasn't always been bad like this, that somehow suffering isn't supposed to be the way life is. What I find absolutely fascinating is the account you find over in the opening chapters of Genesis. In just a few short pages, you find the seed of almost every idea, every single issue that has ever plagued us as a human race. So, for example, in the book of Genesis, we find the birth of urban development, which proved to be a bit of a mixed blessing. On the one hand, When you get a lot of people gathered in one place, you suddenly have access to a lot more resources. You get better hospitals, better doctors, better orchestras, better libraries, and so on. But then you've got to ask, why do so many people want to leave the city and move out to the country? It's because a lot of people squeezed into one small place comes with some pretty notable problems. You get more crime, more pollution, higher cost of living, and far more poverty. People in large urban centers have to steel themselves against pain and suffering because there's just so much of it. And what's curious is the way the opening chapters of Genesis presents the birth of cities in a rather negative light. I mean, who's the first guy to build a city in the Bible? It's Cain, the guy who murdered his brother. Just ask yourself, why is Abel still a relatively popular baby name, but nobody calls their child Cain? It'd be like naming your kid Judas or Lucifer. Now let's take a look at what it actually says in Genesis chapter 4, immediately after Cain is punished and required to leave the area near the gates of Eden. This proves to be leaving the very presence of God. Here's what it says. Then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. When he built a city, he called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch. Now, that's the first mention of a city. And the next key reference to urban development comes just a few chapters later over in Genesis chapter 10, and here's what that says. Cush fathered Nimrod. He was the first on earth to be a mighty man. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. From that land he went into Assyria and built Nineveh, Rehoboth-ir, Calah, and Rezin between Nineveh and Calah. That is the great city. You know, when I was a kid, I knew this guy who ran a trap line. You can tell I'm not from a major urban center. And he had this sign on his house that said, Home of Nimrod, the mighty hunter. Now, I know what he was thinking. He thought that Nimrod was some kind of noble character. After all, the Bible says he was great before God. But when the Bible says he was mighty before the Lord, it's actually talking about his arrogance. This guy was too big for his britches, and ancient legends about him seem to support that idea. He was ruthless, brutal, and utterly selfish. His subjects grew to hate him. So what was the point of Nimrod building all those cities? I'll be right back after this to tell you.
Got kids? Get Discovery Mountain, a free weekly audio adventure to build their faith. Discovery Mountain. It's a place where the air is clear. So clear you can almost hear your imagination. A world of Bible-based wonder for kids everywhere to grow their faith and get closer to Jesus Christ. Discovery Mountain. Free weekly content that'll inspire and engage. Listen anywhere you get your favorite podcasts or at discoverymountain.com.
This is Authentic with Shawn Boonstra and the Voice of Prophecy.
If you look at the list of cities mentioned in Genesis chapter 10, you'll notice that a few of them are pretty famous. You've got the city of Erech, which gave its name to the modern-day nation of Iraq. And then, of course, you've got Nineveh and Babylon, powerful cities, which get used throughout the rest of the Bible to symbolize arrogance and wickedness and rebellion against the God of heaven. So overall, this chapter is not some kind of eulogy for Nimrod. It's not a tribute to his greatness. It's actually a pretty sharp criticism. Why? It's because Nimrod was trying to build artificial paradise. You see, when the human race rebelled against God and no longer had access to the original paradise, survival suddenly became a whole lot harder. Remember what the Bible says. Cursed is the ground because of you, God explains to Adam. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. After our rebellion, life was going to get a whole lot harder because we abandoned the authentic human existence that God originally designed. And so as the new reality began to dawn on folks, some of them decided they could make life better. They might not be in Eden anymore, but they could build their own version of Eden. Walled-off cities with all the resources you could dream of to secure your personal safety and keep yourself relatively comfortable. And honestly, it's not that hard to see the appeal of big urban centers because, well, some of that appeal is still there today. Cities just offer us more opportunities, more resources, and the collective talents of an awful lot of people. They tend to have more of everything, and it's mimicking the ease and abundance of paradise. But here's what happened. If you're going to live in close proximity to an awful lot of very selfish people, and that would be all of us, there's going to be competition over those resources. That would also be true in the countryside, mind you, but when you gather huge numbers of fallen human beings and concentrate them into a really small patch of land, the problem gets magnified. And naturally, selfish people quickly learn that power gives them access to more resources, and so the shrewd among us, the powerful, always seem to rise to the top of the heap. Take, for example, the story of Gilgamesh, the ancient king of the Mesopotamian city of Uruk. Some scholars believe that Gilgamesh was actually the Assyrian version of Nimrod, the same guy. And honestly, there's so much similarity between the two stories, between Nimrod and Gilgamesh, that I think it's true. For starters, you've got the names of the cities they founded, Erech and Uruk. And then, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, you find the story of a man who survived a global flood. Coincidence? But even if they're not the same person, Gilgamesh gives us yet another example of these ancient warrior kings. Just like Nimrod, he was brutal. He enslaved his own men and forced them to build the city walls. And as they were working, he took their wives for himself. According to the Epic of Gilgamesh, which we rediscovered in the ruins of Nineveh back in the 1830s, life in Uruk got so bad that the people cried out to the gods to bring them relief. And sadly, that's the story with most of our human history. Well-intentioned people start making all kinds of promises so they can rise to the top of power. But it seems like as soon as they manage to accumulate even a little bit of that power, they start to think of other people as a way to advance their own interests. They start to think of other people as expendable. And that's why utopian experiments almost always end in disaster. They end with crushing poverty, broken dreams, and an awful lot of dead bodies. When you're sitting in a college classroom reading the utopian dreams of ancient Greek philosophers, it's easy to imagine that Plato might be onto something. Maybe these are good ideas. Maybe we can finally solve our worst problems and just use our logic and reason to restore paradise. But then out there in the real world, every single time somebody tries to do this, an awful lot of people get hurt. And the word hurt is a dramatic understatement. So what would be the alternative? Let's take a look at the biblical prophet Micah, who was preaching in Judah at about the same time that the Assyrians were making life miserable for everybody in the Near East. And at one point, Micah paints a picture of what God originally intended for us. He shows us what an authentic human life is supposed to look like. Just listen to this, because this kind of speaks for itself. It says, "It shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established as the highest of the mountains, and it shall be lifted up above the hills, and peoples shall flow to it, and many nations shall come and say, Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between many peoples, and shall decide disputes for strong nations far away. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. But they shall sit every man under his vine, and under his fig tree, and no one shall make them afraid. For the mouth of the Lord of hosts has spoken." I'll be right back after this.
Dragons, beasts, cryptic statues. If you've ever read Daniel or Revelation and come away scratching your head, you're not alone. Voice of Prophecy's free Focus on Prophecy guides are designed to help you unlock the prophetic mysteries of the Bible and deepen your understanding of God's plan for you and the world around you. You can study online or request them by mail. Visit BibleStudies.com and start bringing prophecy into focus today.
Welcome back. It's Authentic with Shawn Boonstra and the Voice of Prophecy.
Once in a while I'll still pick up this old textbook and thumb through the pages like I did right before I came into the studio today. And I'm seeing these notes in the margins, scribblings I made when I was a teenage freshman at the University of Victoria. And most of the notes I find in here are actually expressions of horror that some people actually think these ideas are some of the best ideas we've ever come up with. I mean, if this is our best, we're in trouble. And I'd throw the book out, but it represents a key point in my own intellectual development. And because it's had such a profound influence on the development of Western civilization, this still has a place on my bookshelf. It's up there with all the other big names like Aristotle or Descartes or Kant or Locke or John Stuart Mill, you name it. You might say that my younger self was a little bit of a philosophy nerd, and I probably still am. But here's what I've noticed after combing through tens of thousands of pages written by our very best thinkers. Not one of these people has ever managed to solve our worst problems. I mean, yes, there are some who contributed to the freedom we now enjoy, and as a fan of religious liberty, I've got to tip my hat in those philosophers' direction for achieving that. I'm also a pretty big fan of the American experiment, at least as it was originally formulated, and I know that we can thank both the reformers and the Enlightenment philosophers for a lot of what happened. You see, a lot of the ideas that led to the birth of Western liberty actually came from the minds of Bible-believing Christians, dedicated reformers who compared the people who run the world with what God says should be happening. And these people were absolutely right. The Scriptures represent the highest possible ideal, and wouldn't you know it, the Scriptures do that without the need to subjugate and use people to achieve an end. So, out of all the books on my shelf, there's only one that I reach for every single day, and it's this one. The Bible, the book inspired by the one who made us in the first place. And in the pages of the Bible, what I find is a righteous king who turned our ideas of good government completely on their head. Instead of forcing us to serve him, he came to the world and served us. Instead of demanding our blood for his cause, he shed his blood to save us. In other words, God places the highest possible value on your life. God doesn't lie to get his way. In fact, before the story is finished, the Bible says God opens the books of heaven and shows us absolutely everything. He doesn't force us to live a certain way. He doesn't try to censor us, even though he'd be the one being in the whole universe who had an absolute right to do that. You know, given the current mess that our world is in right now, I think you might find it a welcome relief to spend a little more time reading what God says human life is supposed to be like. I think you'll find hope when you see that God intends to give everything back in spite of what we've done. I mean, sure, you can go out and pattern yourself after tyrants, or you can pattern yourself after a man who was the smartest man in the room, but still chose to give his life at Calvary for you. Thanks for joining me today. I'm Shawn Boonstra, and this has been Authentic.
You've been listening to Authentic, sponsored by Voice of Prophecy. Remember, you can listen every week right here at the same time. And thank you. Authentic is funded by listeners just like you. You can support at voiceofprophecy.com. That's also where you can find all the episodes you missed, or where you can listen again. That's voiceofprophecy.com.